We are now recording, so welcome everyone to our last call for January already. We've flown through the month. So as you are all, I hope, aware, this week we're going to do the sort of second of our two back-to-back sessions on the sort of DNS for EU project. Those of you that were on the call last week will have heard an update from the perspective of the consortium charged with delivering the new open resolver, sort of part funded by the European Commission. So you heard, if you like, the technical sort of project update. We're taking a slightly different tack this week. Roxana, who's joined us, which who, as you can see on the screen, is an associate professor of digital technology and public policy, which is always, I think, a really good combination of things to be looking at within the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford University. And Roxana recently wrote a sort of paper sort of just taking a look more from the policy sort of perspective of the project, and I've shared a link with the reminder about the call. I'll share the link also after this call as well. But she kindly volunteered to sort of share her sort of perspective on the project, some of her conclusions, I presume echoing some of the content of the paper and maybe adding some additional insights, but we'll find out. As always, we'll have time for sort of a discussion after sort of Roxana's taken us through her presentation. So I think without further ado, Roxana, thank you for coming on, welcome, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Hello, everyone. As you could guess from the presentation that Andrew just did, I am not a technologist. I'm a political scientist, but somebody who has been interested in this space, and in particular in the power dynamics that come with it, especially when we look at critical internet infrastructures and resources. So you'll see a little bit of that in the presentation today, where I take a policy perspective to what has happened. First, with the concentration of the DNS market, and second, with the attempt by the European Union to strengthen its own strategic autonomy with an initiative like the one we have been discussing now for 2 sessions, the DNS for EU. So I'll just share some slides that can help us in the discussion. And I'll start with unpacking a little bit the title here. As you would have imagined by now, as you would have guessed, the resolutions we talk about here are not the New Year's resolution, although it's still end of January, we could very well do so, go through what we have achieved since we made the promises. But in this particular presentation, I'm interested in looking at what the initial promises of the internet were and how far away from that we've moved. So we start with the decentralized DNS resolver market, and we end with the European approach. And if we start from where policymakers usually start, there is this big mismatch. If you look at the discourse coming out of Brussels, but generally also Washington, to a certain extent, some of the national capitals, you'll hear a lot about standing on these very strong foundations, and maybe we have more work to do on infrastructure, but generally we're in a good position. And where we need to work more is at the level of regulation. So we'll have these different areas, subtopics that need to be better contained in a legal way. And that's about it. We build on these strong foundations and we get here. But the reality, as we all know in this group, is very different. We stand on very shaky foundations. And of course, this is a meme that you've all come across. It talks about the DNS being this flimsy TXT file. It's a bit more complicated than that, but the reality is we are not standing on very strong foundations. And why is the DNS important? For all these different reasons, of course, we are all aware of that. We go from security to privacy risks, all the way to public policy concerns. And again, a meme that has made the rounds in the internet sphere. It's the question of security incidents being causally linked to the DNS, whether we know it or not, it's always the DNS. So I'll skim through this very quickly because it's a bit more of a background that speaks to policymakers and to people who haven't looked at this in a lot of detail. Why is the internet still standing? And we have multiple explanations for it, but I think one that is quite powerful is the fact that it has always been distributed and decentralized. So despite the vulnerability that's inherent in the DNS, because we have managed to set this up as a distributed and decentralized system, it was reliable enough. But that is starting to change. What we have today is a distributed but centralized system, or increasingly centralized. And that's where we need to look a little bit more closely and scrutinize a little bit more the market concentration and the points of control. And DNS resolution in itself is by definition a point of control. We can have ISPs doing that. We can have cloud providers putting forward these public DNS services. We can have governments doing it with protective DNS. We can have non-for-profit organizations providing the services. But at the end of the day, they sit in between our own devices, applications and operating systems and the servers that respond to the queries. So from the start, this used to be a highly decentralized market. Every ISP was doing it for the people they were serving. And that has started to change in 2009 when Google entered this market, providing its own public DNS service. And just like the ISP, Google was also providing it for free. But there are a couple of important differences because Google being such an important player in the internet market globally, they can provide more secure, faster, more reliable services. And just like Google, we have Cloudflare that has also taken up quite a bit of the market. So this is starting to change. And there's an entire discussion right now happening around what are some of the pros and cons of using public resolvers. And here you have just some of the key advantages and disadvantages. It's a whole discussion around it. We are not going to do it right now, but you'll see some of these elements of enhanced security, availability, and performance that come with larger providers at the same time that can constitute a single point of failure. And we've had cases in the past where some of these incidents were related to one point of failure. We've had some concerns related to privacy and user support. There's the fact that there's also no service level agreement. There are no minimum conditions to be met to provide this service. And interestingly enough, we have a situation where ISPs themselves might decide that they want to use another public resolver to serve their customers. So we've had interesting cases for very different reasons all around the world. I'll give you an example from Switzerland, where I was based at the time this was happening. So I was using a telecom operator that decided to switch to Google without ever informing us. But they did that in light of national legislation that was coming into force to prevent the accessing of casino websites from Swiss territory. But with that, a lot of other things have changed in the way they were configuring the service. So we found out indirectly that this was happening. And there was no obligation on their side or on Google's side to inform us that they have switched providers. So there are these elements as well. And then the exceptions, interestingly enough, you can see them as pros or cons. You have a number of regulatory constraints that generally ISPs have to abide by. They are bound by the national legislation, and they have to comply with all these different requirements. It's not the case if the service is operated from a different jurisdiction, and if the headquarters of the company running the service is outside of your own territory, there is absolutely nothing to be done about it other than just filtering that particular provider out. It has happened. There is a case from Turkey a couple of years ago. They were simply blocking the service to Google altogether. But there are also other instances where, again, the ISPs themselves might want to avoid the liability for their users trying to get to content that is otherwise not allowed in the country. So they go with a service that simply doesn't need to worry about these requirements. And then there are the mandated restrictions that can play out either in favor or against. Hard to judge. It's really a case-by-case situation. And just to give you a little bit more context about this research that I'm conducting, it started a couple of years ago where we wanted to look at the concentration in the DNS resolver market. And there wasn't enough data available at that point in time. This was 2019, 2020. And we were able to run our own measurement on the data, the Open Observatory of Internet Interference. We were looking at mobile data only, and we were able to get a longitudinal set of inputs, so we could look at different points in the evolution of this market to 2016 and 2019. And out of that came this follow-up project that was directly linked to how we perceived concentration in the market, which is the DNS for EU, the second part of my research. And what we discovered when we ran this in 2020 was that the market has indeed changed considerably. What you see on the left shows a much more decentralized picture than what you see on the right. And that's because by 2019, both Cloudflare and Google owned about 50% of the market. So taken together, Cloudflare was still a lot smaller, under 10%, but Google was increasingly more present. And you see that Google is present in both images. So it has increased its market share from one year to the other in important ways. But the other thing we noticed was also that longevity in the market didn't seem to make a big difference, that Cloudflare was able to catch up in the same way Google was able to acquire a lot more clients in the market very easily. So longevity didn't make a difference, but what made a difference was the consolidation of these different structural powers that very large cloud providers had. And we concluded that they were able to create this two-sided market where on the one hand, they were offering the service for free to clients who could set it up themselves or via ISPs. And they were making money out of this in a second market, which was the one around the health and the status of the internet traffic. So getting the intelligence out of that and making that into a monetary reward was the second part of the market. So on the one hand, you offer everything for free, but you make sure that it means something else in terms of intelligence sharing, and that's where the money comes from. We also noticed that there was an integration of this DNS traffic intelligence into other services. So where there wasn't a direct monetization, whether for advertising or similar purposes, there was an attempt to integrate this into the services they were offering, making these companies a lot more competitive. So whether that was for email services, whether that was for all sorts of other services on offer, they were able to capitalize on this set of data. Then there was also the question of circumventing network blocking, which we found was one of the key reasons for providers to switch, especially larger scale providers to switch to public resolvers. And there were also implications for the loss of privacy as well as for centralization of control. But I think the first three were the key findings that gave us some food for thought as we went into reconsidering centralization of control. So we said in the beginning that the DNS resolution represents a control point. For all these reasons, you can have a number of actors that can provide it, but at the end of the day, it's the intermediary between these two sides. On the one hand, you have the user, and then you have the broader servers and infrastructure that come with the internet traffic. And whoever sits in the middle is able to do quite a bit. And the EU has also looked at it in the same way. They said, well, based on some of the data available, and again, there isn't one consolidated set of information regarding measurements in this space. Our own research showed that both Cloudflare and Google had an increasing share of the market, but in Europe, we weren't able to test specifically for it, but we assumed that it was very similar to what we were seeing at the global level. There were then different measurements. Some say about 20% of the market in the EU is actually controlled by Google. Some other measurements show that it really depends whether you look at individual users or businesses, and you might have variations there, whether it's the weekend or it's weekdays. But in principle, there is an increasing presence of these cloud providers also on the European market. We can't quantify exactly how much of the market they have, but they are there. And the EU has considered a number of options, and this is my own understanding of some of the options available, but I'm not sure Brussels went through considerations of all of this. But if we were worried about concentration in this market, and some of the other dynamics indicate that policymakers are indeed worried about it, what could be done? So one option here is to ensure that there are minimum safeguards for all of the providers in the market, whether they are ISPs or they are cloud providers. It seems this wasn't the option that the EU wanted to go for, although there is more and more regulation and also cybersecurity packages that reflect there will be more obligations imposed on intermediaries. Then there was the option of developing national resolvers. Many countries have started considering this option. For sure, the UK has given that example, and it seems to be successful to a certain extent. So this is the initiative of the National Cybersecurity Center here in the UK that is open to all the public services and increasingly also to NGOs and potentially business. Then there was the option of increasing competition altogether, so adding another market player, which is what the EU has decided to go for with the DNS for EU initiative. There's also a possibility to work on the transparency for users, and importantly, especially for people who look at measurements and also academics, but I think policymakers as well, developing that capacity to monitor DNS trends. For the time being, we're still lacking a way to understand how to get this data, how to model it into what we need, and what oversight mechanisms we can set up for this to be a continuous process rather than one-off. This is it. This is a market analysis. We move on, and then in 10 years' time, we come back to it. So if we look at the European approach, we see there were different reasons to invest in DNS for EU. The tender itself, the one that was issued in January 2022, so 2 years ago, was specifying that there was a lack of a business case to have such a unified DNS resolver at the EU level, because the DNS resolution service is provided for free. there wasn't a case for those who would be interested just to invest in it as is. So this part funding, or if you want almost a public subsidy, that was offered up to 14 million for a 3-year project, came to fill that gap. But tender also recognized that there was a possibility to reduce vulnerability in a market that is already highly concentrated. And they mentioned very clearly that the power there is in the hands of very few players. That there was a possibility to strengthen the European strategic autonomy and to develop a system that is compatible with EU regulations, and in particular also with national restrictions. And if you were attending last week's session with Wellbone, you heard a lot more about how they plan to go about it. It's not a EU filtering system, but it's really responsive to some of these variations in EU member states. And the process started, as I said, in January. There was a deadline for this tender, 20th of March or something similar, that needed to be extended for another month. Obviously, there was an initial reaction that this was simply not enough time to put together a consortium. The obligation there was to have at least 3 European partners come up with a federated governance structure and demonstrate the sustainability of the service. So doing all that in 3 months seemed like mission impossible, and it was the very first reaction that I've heard from the technical community. The other aspect of the tender that drew a lot of attention was the proposition for the seed funding to set up the infrastructure, but not to run it once it was up. So there was almost no incentive for people who were already operating such an infrastructure to apply for this tender. It simply wasn't covering the costs of operating the service. And with that, we also heard a number of other reactions that had to do with the kind of incentives that such a tender would create. And I've put here one that was particularly interesting from Quad 9, which says this is a one-time funding and it does not create circumstances that incentivize adopting security and privacy enhancements for operators of existing platforms or services for resolvers. So at this point, you get this split in the technical community, the people who think, yes, we should sit together and think of a way to make it happen. And the others want to say, these are just the wrong sets of incentives and we can just move on and ignore this. The winning consortium, you've seen a representative last week, was one of the 3 applications that reached the final stage. So Wellbone, together with 12 other partners from different parts of Europe, won this tender. And their proposal was quite interesting because it reflected a certain vision for the implementation plans, going from threat intelligence as the first pillar for their proposal to DNS for telcos, which was coming very close to the business model they already had. Then DNS for governments, offering the protective DNS with adjustments as needed for different requirements, and then DNS for users, the most complicated pillar in a way, the one that is also set up to come at the very end of the project. And with this, you see some of the strategic objectives with the sequencing of the plans. On the one hand, you see the incentive to work at a much higher level to start with, so both telco and governments, in order to get to that sustainability requirement that comes as part of the tender conditions. But you also see the focus on threat intelligence, which they perceive as the core for doing this kind of work. And here, just a brief discussion around some of these competitive advantages that could also constitute limitations. So the EU has set forward this very ambitious plan, again, with some funding attached to it, only one-time disbursement of funds for 3 years. But it's assumed that there would be a high adoption rate. At least reading the tender and reading the documents that accompany it, you get this sense of a successful initiative being on its way. And that actually depends on a number of factors because it remains voluntary. The EU has not specified that this would become mandatory at any point. But the assumption is that once you have a highly functional and performance service, you could target multiple customer bases. And that goes across the board from residential to vertical sectors. And that's an interesting proposition. And on top of that, you could add this premium services that they were talking about. But it doesn't really take into account some differentiated needs and granularity of privacy provisions and interests of these different communities. So it's very hard to imagine a system that is relatively standardized and delivers for all of these different groupings of customers. So we'll see how this evolves in the DNS for EU proposal, but this could be one of the sticking points because there isn't a mandatory adoption of the service. And as we've heard, in the beginning, there was a lot of interest to potentially make it mandatory down the line for public administration. And it's even part of the proposal where they say this is where it's most needed. But there hasn't been any follow-up since. So we shall see. There are many other documents that the EU is working on at the moment. So it might be complementary to those. There's also an interesting impact that the initiative could have on the local threat analysis market because the local threats were actually underrepresented in the global feeds. So this could actually be strengthened as part of the initiative. There's a question mark around the engagement with the DNS standardization community. On the one hand, the tender specifies very clearly that they expect the consortium to adopt the latest privacy and security protocols and abide by the highest standards available. At the same time, there isn't a very clear indication of how that would play out in the European context, where we have huge variation from one country to the other, especially in the adoption of voluntary standards. So DNSSEC goes from 5% in Romania all the way to 95% in Finland. There's huge variation. So there isn't a clear understanding as to whether the consortium should also drive some of these discussions around standardization and potentially implementation down the line. And finally, there is a vision of strategic autonomy that starts to be matched by actual efforts. We're not only providing the discourse anymore. We're not just talking in broad terms at the European level. We're starting to agree on what that vision might involve at a lower level. So here we're seeing those first building blocks, and I'm arguing we still have to understand whether that's a step change or it's a very small change. But of course, there isn't a single action coming from the European Commission in this area. We're having many complementary efforts as well. So it has to be considered as part of this broader move towards strategic autonomy. And here, I think two interesting directives are worth mentioning. It's the NIS2. Obviously, there is an encouragement there for a DNS resolution diversification strategy that seems to cut across the board and goes in that direction of pretty much raising the standard for everyone. It's not exactly a direct implementation of that principle, but we could see it happening. And that comes also with an encouragement to use the European DNS resolver service. With the Digital Services Act, it's a bit more complicated in the sense that the DNS resolvers are mere conduit intermediary services. But because there's a lot of specificity around how this has to be fitting under all the European, but also national legislation, there is an indirect encouragement to use services that are actually aware of that and comply with all these differences. So depending on how we want to interpret this, this might be going in the same direction as the NIS2 directive, encouraging everybody to use the European DNS resolver service. And there is finally a definition for digital strategic autonomy. We've been waiting for a long time for this. We've heard a lot about digital sovereignty and variations of it, but we're now moving towards a more unified vision that seems to be strategic autonomy. And ENISA conducted a consultation in 2021 and came up with this definition for it: the ability of Europe to source products and services that meet its needs and values without undue influence from the outside world. We seem to have an embodiment of that with the DNS for EU. And it comes with this very strict check on foreign control and foreign influence. So part of the requirements pretty much specify there can't be anything outside of Europe. So the sourcing and the implementation has to stay within Europe. And ultimately, the data collected will remain within the European territory. So that seems to be a step in that direction, and we'll have to see how it ends up being implemented and what adoption rates we will be seeing. But I'll stop here to give everybody a chance to ask questions or open the discussion. This is just a final slide with some of the academic work that informs this presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
Perfect, thank you, Roxana. That's really interesting. I particularly loved the chart showing that how the sort of market share effectively had evolved, which painted a very useful sort of very visual sort of imagery showing the progression over, I think, was it 5 years. You might want to touch base, if you haven't done so already, with the team at APNIC, Jeff Huston and co, as they got some good data as well in that general space. But yeah, very interesting. So yeah, we got some time for any questions people might have. So as always, you can raise your virtual hand and talk, or alternatively put questions in the chat if that's easier. And I can see that Kurt's already done the latter. So I'll read it out just so that anyone that's listening to the recording knows what you've asked Kurt, which is, Roxana, do you personally believe this project has a potential to break operations of the European internet as a whole? I'm actually very careful about endorsing the use and promotion of this project.
Thank you very much for this question. It's a great one. I don't really know where I stand on this. So I think you have a wide spectrum here, going from Internet Society listing DNS for EU just recently, a couple of days ago, as one of the factors driving fragmentation of the internet, all the way to people being very confident and saying this is what we should be doing and what we should have done all along, because all of these other governments are doing protective DNS. So if we can scale that up and make it European protective, why not? It's a good, very good question. So I guess as a policy analyst right now, I would say the EU is learning from past mistakes and they are trying to do things better. And you see, they never rely on a single way of doing things. So it's always complemented by many other measures. So they take some precautions in case it fails. That's not to say that they don't necessarily trust it could succeed, but I think it's really one of those situations where you want to have as many reliable and sustainable points as possible. So I don't think there is anything to indicate right now that the project wouldn't succeed. But my expectation is to see some mandatory adoption coming with a new set of legislation, to say at some point in a couple of years' time, once this project is full-fledged and well-developed, to say, well, if you're public administration in Europe, you're gonna use this, and same if you're, you know, one of the bigger institutions, you're probably going to have to use this. Yeah, that's my understanding of the market.
That would fit with the NIS2 sort of obligations potentially, as you said earlier, wouldn't it, Roxana? Thank you. Right, I can say a question in the chat, and then Andreas has a question as well. So I'll read out Vicky's question first, which is with all the other increased work on internet and software regulation in the EU, I was surprised this desire for an EU-approved resolver didn't instead result in an update to NIS2, creating requirements on resolver operators instead of creating another resolver operator. Do you have any idea what might be happening as far as implementation of encouraging resolver operators to use secure options, as you mentioned in your slides?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting move, I would say, from Brussels to just have that public intervention in a market that has always been private. We always had the exception of the UK government having the protective service. We had the Canadian Shield as an alternative, a bit more open than the UK option. And then obviously now we have Australia and the US moving into that space as well with protective DNS. But it has always been restricted to government players and government operators. And now we are seeing a very different trend with DNS for EU, where the funding and the encouragement is to move this across the board, right? The whole market will be affected by it. It isn't a single instance. It's not just government services. So that is a really interesting public intervention. Again, we've never seen anything of this kind before. So we are definitely watching very closely what is happening. And it's hard to predict exactly what that's going to look like in a couple of years from now. Again, my understanding is we're probably going to have more mandatory adoption than we would have expected 2 years ago, but let's wait and see. Are we also seeing some secure options for other resolvers? Yes, I mean, that comes with NIS2. I think the idea is that you will have to diversify as much as you can within Europe, and you can only diversify if you involve the most secure operators. I don't think there's going to be that much space if you're complying with the regulation to not check for security and privacy safeguards. I think you're indirectly going to have to follow that, yes.
Great, thank you. Right, we'll probably close the queue there. So we've got Andreas and then another question in the chat. So Andreas first.
Yeah. So whenever you're talking to DNS, to somebody about DNS for EU, some people ask questions like, wouldn't that open door for censorship for European government? So what's your view on this? Do we face any higher risk in such a centralized DNS for EU service to push more or less for censorship more, or do you see it's even less risky to see censorship happening in the European Union?
It's a good question. So we won't see one big move towards censorship. I don't think we can expect that. We're going to see that each country will have something adapted to its national legislation. But of course, that differs massively. It's 27 different countries in the EU, so you'll see variations. I think it was explained quite clearly also by Robert last time that they are not working towards a massive censorship program of any kind, but they will just make sure that there is enough in compliance with the national legislation. So what the consortium option gives them is the possibility to not go necessarily with a European standard, but really adapt to local level, and they will have enough partners around Europe to be able to do that consistently. So it does make sense to look at it as a way to adapt to national legislation without imposing a censorship scheme or making it a European level censorship. There is some overlap between restrictions within Europe. So yes, you'll see certain countries that come more closely to others, but there's also enough to differentiate this. So their ability to operate this at the local level makes a huge difference. Down the line, because we have less operators, if you want, in the European market, if that's that results into further censorship, I would not be able to tell. I think we have the extremes. On the one hand, you have the cloud providers, the big ones that don't follow any of the national restrictions. And then you have the local ones who are maybe too bound by national restrictions. So in between, we could possibly have this European service. We'll have to wait and see how it plays out.
Thank you. And then last question, which is quite a good one, follow on from that. Do you perceive the DNS for EU program contributing to the concentration of the DNS market or helping DNS resolution diversification?
Yeah, it's a very good one. I'm still struggling with this question. It is definitely going in the direction of concentration. We are talking about financially supporting, at least partly supporting, a player that could compete with Google and Cloudflare and so on and so forth. This is what it is all about at the end of the day. Now, does that mean that in Europe we're going to see a lot of DNS for EU and maybe a little bit of cloud providers and then a little bit of ISP providers? Most likely. I think we're moving towards a market that will have all of these options available. And then it's going to be a question of all the other legislation and all the other mandatory provisions that make a difference. So do you still go with Google or do you still go with your local ISPs? It will depend a lot on what other provisions they've put in place. For me, it looks like it's always going to be at least a market with several players, and depending on the objectives of the companies, of the objective of the governments, you might see more or less interest in diversification. It's too early to tell, right? A lot will depend on the adoption rate. So if DNS for EU ends up being really important, then there is a clear incentive to rely on the one that would have most data, most local threats, intelligence, and so on. But if it becomes just the size of an ISP, then maybe we'll think about it differently. I guess everybody's just waiting to see how this turns out to be.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that, Roxana. I think it was really interesting just to sort of sit back and just get that context and think about the direction it might go. I guess we probably want to have another look in 12 months' time and see how things have moved. It might become a little bit clearer as the sort of project moves more towards implementation, whereas we're still at the relatively early days at the moment. But yeah, thank you for the analysis, and I put a link to the paper in the chat as well at the top of the chat for people to peruse that if you've not already had a chance to do so. Right, well, let's draw a line there. I'll just do a very quick run through a couple of other things, and then if there's time at the end, we'll pause for any other business. So just bear with me whilst I just share my screen again. Right, so I'll spend less time this week on some of the recent developments, just in the interest of time. I will highlight, though, top of the chart there, that the Enterprise Security Group have published their thoughts on the likely impact of encrypted client hello on enterprise security. They've published that on behalf of, I think, sponsored by Broadcom. As a reminder, encrypted client hello, or ECH, is an extension to the TLS 1.3 protocol. It's still not a standard. It's not yet quite got to working group last call within the ITF, but I think that is imminent. So those of you that have got interested in the enterprise security space may find the white paper of interest. Other things, just briefly, the Centre Jamboree 2024 at the end of May have got a call for proposals, and they've changed the format this year in that they've opened up attendance to non-centre members. I think on the back of repeated requests apparently over the last few years from non-members to participate. So that's now an opportunity for anyone that wants to speak, lead a session or moderate a session, etc., to come along and participate along with the centre membership. Other things, there's some sort of thoughts on trends in enterprise cybersecurity from, as we've just been talking about it, the DNS for EU consortium, and a new dashboard looking at ransomware, which has highlighted that the most common indicators of compromise that they identified over the last month were MX and DNS misconfigurations that allowed for spoofing and phishing attacks. So I think that's helpful to understand things to check to look at the strength of your security. Again, if you're in the enterprise cybersecurity space, I won't dwell on these other things. I just maybe mention the one at the bottom, which is since I've talked about quantum computing aspects over the last couple of weeks or so, and that's further news on that this week, that Deutsche Telekom, its T-Systems division, has established a new quantum computing related partnership with a comparatively powerful quantum computer. Mr. Word, they're ion trap based quantum computing, I believe. That should say just the last line of that session. Okay, there's a whole bunch of other stuff which I found personally interesting, which you can peruse at your leisure. I just highlight the one at the top, which is that there's an OpenAI's GPT a new store to give competition to the likes of the Google Play Store and the Apple Store. More or less coinciding with some announcements that Apple will support or allow for the establishment of additional app stores on these within the Apple ecosystem, at least in Europe. I'm not sure if they will be accessible from elsewhere. So there's a few developments in that space coming up. Other things you can read at your leisure if those are of interest to you. So I won't talk this through given time. I will highlight though that we've got quite a few deadlines that are imminent, one of which is actually today, which is if you want to respond to the call for papers for the forthcoming Apricot event, which I think it takes place at the end of February in, I think it's Thailand. Then the deadline is today for papers to be submitted, and then tomorrow we've got a deadline if you want to put in responses to an expanding online trust and safety research, and then on Wednesday the IGF 2024 call for thematic inputs closes, as does the Morg Lightning Talk call for proposals. So there's a few things there that if you want to sort of put those in, you've got a relatively limited time to do so, just as a reminder. I'll just highlight two other things on this second side. Again, these are sort of forthcoming calls for papers, etc. And there's a couple more on the academia side. Third from bottom, Cybersecurity Academic Startup Accelerator Program. There's some potential funding available, and you need to put proposals in between the 5th of February and 6th of March, so you've got just over a month to do that. And then I think I mentioned before the ICANN grant program will be opening up in a couple of months, but there's some advanced information on the nature of the program should you be so interested. Okay, the other thing I just wanted to remind people, ITF 119 in Brisbane, if you plan to attend either in person or remotely, the super early rate expires tonight, 23:59 UTC, I believe. In fact, that's exactly what it says on the slide, so that's correct. And just bear in mind that the increase after today is reasonably significant. So certainly for in-person, a week pass goes up from $875 to $1,095. So a couple of $100 or so increase if you don't register by close of today, but do plan to attend. The sort of remote registration also increases, but that's by $60 rather than 200 odd. I should also say that fee waivers are available. You can apply for those through the registration site. That's primarily only for remote attendance, though, rather than in-person attendance. But those are available as well if the cost of attendance is challenging. And then we've got a whole bunch of other events coming up over the next, well, starting this week, actually, if you're going to the EU's Open Source Policy Summit in Brussels. That's the end of this week. And then OARC takes place next week. And then there's a whole raft of stuff running through this month onwards, sorry, February onwards. So plenty for your diary if that's of interest to you. I won't talk through all of those, but there's plenty there. In terms of future call topics, no major changes here. So just a reminder, we should be talking through an internet standards tracker focused on the IETF specifically next week. And then you've got other stuff again on the screen you can see for the sort of coming weeks. I've got a few feelers out on topics to add. One which I touched on briefly last week, of seeing if we can find someone to talk to the topic of the multi-signer model. Thanks to Vicky for a suggestion there. If anyone else has got any suggested speakers in that space, please let me know. And equally, if you've got other topics you'd like to see added.
So
again,
Andrew, I had
Vicky,
suggested Matthias Macking from the Bind team, but when I reached out to him, he mentioned that Ralph is also part of the working group that is working on that. So since he's a regular participant, he might be another person you could draft for this.
Perfect. I will drop Ralph a line as well. Thank you. That's 2 suggestions. I mean, that's impressive, Vicky. Thank you very much. That's most helpful. Okay, let me stop speaking there and just stop sharing my screen as well and just pause and say, so we're on any other business. We've got a couple of minutes before the top of the hour. So I just wanted to pause to see if anyone had anything else you wanted to just raise. And if so, please do so now. Either pop it in the chat and I'll read it out loud, or just unmute and say what it is if that's easier for you. You're not seeing anyone. I don't think I'm muting at the moment. Just give it another few seconds in case someone's typing furiously. It hasn't registered on my device just yet. Okay, it doesn't look like it. In which case, thank you very much, everyone, for your time. Particular thanks, Roxana, for your excellent presentation. I'm sure that's provoked a few thoughts that people will just dwell on post-call, so that's really useful. Have a fantastic week, everyone, and I look forward to catching up same time next week. So see everyone then, and if not, talk in the meantime. Thanks all. Bye.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Bye.
Thank you.